Good morning, folks. This is Mr. Braun, and today we are going to be learning about Judaism. You'll see in the center picture there are two Jewish men praying at the Western Wall, and these are Orthodox Jews, which we'll be learning about in a little bit. And what they're wearing is often very symbolic. And you'll notice, too, on either side of them are two stars of David, or six-pointed stars, which is a very common symbol of Judaism. So Judaism was started by a man named Abraham, or Abram, around 1000 BC in the Middle East, and around the areas of present-day Iraq, Israel, and Lebanon are where much of the early roots of Judaism took place. Although they had influences in much larger areas, that's traditionally believed to be more of the center of where Judaism is from. This man named Abraham is also going to influence two other religions, namely Christianity and Islam. All three religions are called Abrahamic religions because they trace their roots to this one person. And according to Jewish tradition, their God chose the Hebrew people and Abraham's descendants to be his people as long as they worship him as their one God. And so this agreement is called the Great Covenant and is a very important cornerstone to Jewish beliefs and Jewish traditions. And Judaism is one of the first strictly monotheistic religions in the world. And what's interesting and unique about Judaism is that Jewish people are not just considered to be members of a religion, but they're also considered to be their own race as well. It's also an ethnic religion. And this idea of Judaism and Jews being both a religion and a race is going to shape much of their history and much of the history we are going to be learning about this year from 1000 BC all the way through the 20th century and into today's society. And you'll notice this area here that I talked about before in the Middle East, and traditionally, namely Israel, present-day Israel, that area in pink is considered to be the homeland of the Jewish people and is very important to not only their history, but also to their practices. So those practices and those beliefs of Judaism, one of the most important things is that Judaism is strictly monotheistic. That they believe that there is only one God and one person that is God. And that God's laws can be found in a book called the Torah. And each of those laws are called mitzvahs, or commandments. And there's a total of 613 mitzvahs, or laws, that Jewish people have to follow. And these are their God's rules for how to be holy and how to live a holy life. And the more rules one follows and practices, the holier that person is. So the holiest person would be somebody that lives out and follows all 613 mitzvahs. Some examples of them are listed below. And some of these are actually good rules to follow to just be a good human being. And some of these are actually good rules to follow to lead a healthy life. And we'll be talking about that idea later on. And some rules are for them to follow are to make them separate and to really distinguish themselves as a Jewish people from every other person around them. So this is one reason why sometimes Jewish people may look or act differently than the other cultures that they may live in. So these mitzvahs can be boiled down to what's called the Ten Commandments. And these are what Jewish people believe were given to Moses, one of their prophets. And if you took all the 613 mitzvahs and boiled them down to the most important ideas, it comes down to these 10. And these tell people how they should behave and live their life toward God and one another. Now, Jewish beliefs and these mitzvahs are one to create a separation. So there's an us versus them. There's a very distinct idea and practice of what makes a Jewish person Jewish and different from every other culture around them. And so this can be traced to sometimes what they eat or do not eat, or how they dress, or what they do. Some of these examples are for men not to shave, and to not shave the sides of their head. Circumcision. At a time thousands of years ago, when nobody circumcised their young, Jewish people did. And nowadays in the 21st century, we have medically proven that this is often very healthy and is easier to not get infections for men, as well as different dietary practices. The key idea with these mitzvahs is that following these mitzvahs makes you holy. Your actions as a Jewish person and following these mitzvahs makes you holy. A very key idea, especially in our next lecture when we look at Christianity and see how that's a little bit different than in Christianity. But in Judaism, your actions are what makes you holy. And you can see here the reason for that coming from the Jewish Torah. It says that their God says to them, "You should be holy to me, for I am the Lord, am holy, and I am setting you apart from all other people as my own people." So there are many different holy places in Judaism throughout the world. You'll notice these three pictures here. These are actually primary sources that I had taken, which you guys remember what that primary source is from 2 units ago. And one of the most important holy places in Judaism is the temple, which is now destroyed. It was originally built by Solomon, King Solomon, and rebuilt by Herod the Great in Jerusalem. In the bottom right picture, you'll see there's a Muslim mosque with a golden dome in the background, and that's actually the location of where the temple was built. And this is considered to be one of the holiest or the holiest sites in all of Judaism. The Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is in the picture in the bottom left, and this was the outermost wall of the rebuilt temple grounds by Herod the Great, and unfortunately is the last remaining section of that wall to this day. It's also the closest that Jewish people can get to the location of where the temple used to be. So this is a place where you'll often see many Jewish people around praying at and leaving messages and prayers in the wall. Synagogues are Jewish houses of worship, and they're located throughout the world. Many major cities worldwide have a synagogue where Jews go to pray and be together as a Jewish people. And Jerusalem itself is considered a very holy place in Judaism, that city of where the Western Wall and temples are. And it's very important, not only to Jewish religion, but to the Jewish history and identity. And the same goes for Israel. Important Jewish or Hebrew people throughout their entire history have made different impacts on both their culture and religion. And primarily, the patriarchs were those people that helped to start and found the religion and the Hebrew people. Most notably, Abraham, who we talked about before, and Moses, one of the greatest prophets in Jewish tradition, and the person who received the Ten Commandments. There also are prophets with different people who came in times of need to preach their God's word and correct any wrongdoing and to really help the Jewish people. There are also judges, which were people or heroes and warriors, both men and women, that led the Hebrew people against their enemies and protected themselves, their people, and their land. And lastly, kings. These were political leaders and religious leaders of the Hebrew kingdoms. And most notably, in the picture above, King Solomon, who built the temple. So some Jewish practices that are really important to them are prayer. And this is traditionally done 3 times a day, most notably in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night. And you'll notice that picture at the bottom, this is at the Western Wall. And prayer can be an individual thing, or it can be communal in large groups, in synagogues, or even on the street corners like you see in the top picture. Clothing is also a part of Jewish religious practice. The kippah, or yarmulke, is worn by men, especially at synagogues and holy sites. The tzitzit is that tasseled shawl or belt that you'll see men wear and is often worn during times of prayer, especially at synagogue or at Shabbat. The tefillin is the leather strap you see wrapped around this man's arms and his head, and at the end of it is a leather box or wooden box that contains many prayers. And this is traditionally worn during the morning prayer. And the kittel, which is worn in synagogue for different ceremonies. Other practices include holy days and holidays. Like we saw in class, every religion has sacred space, times in a person's life or throughout the year that are holy and to be celebrated. Most notably is Shabbat. This is a weekly practice that starts on sundown of Friday and goes until sundown of Saturday. And this is a time to be prayerful, to be with one's family, and a time of rest. And unlike many other cultures, this was developed thousands of years ago, where one day out of 7, Jewish people, according to their religion, were required to rest. Every other culture or practice at that time in ancient civilizations, and even into many of the modern day, there was no day of rest. Judaism is the religion that gives us our weekend. So if you don't like to be at school on Saturdays and Sundays, you can thank the Jewish religion and the Jewish people, because they are the culture and religion that gives us our weekend. Passover is another one where the Jewish people were rescued from their bondage and slavery in Egypt. And this is a one day of the year where they stop to remember and commemorate and give thanks for being free. Different dietary customs include being kosher. And kosher is a set of different dietary practices of what Jewish people can eat and not eat, or how different food is prepared. One is no milk with the mother. So anything that is dairy cannot be served with meat. So if you like a cheeseburger, that is not kosher, because you're serving that cheese with meat. And also different customs such as no shellfish, cloven animals, swine. And these are very healthy, actually. At a time before refrigeration and modern sterilization and things that we know about today, shellfish are very easily contaminated and can very easily spoil and make you sick. The same thing with pork. Pork needs to be very thoroughly cooked. There could be bacteria in pork if it's not very thoroughly cooked. Other Jewish practices include the High Holy Days, and these are 2 separate holidays where Jews come together to celebrate and worship together. The first being Rosh Hashanah, and just like on December 31st, many of us celebrate New Year's Eve and New Year's Day on January 1st, so too do the Jews celebrate and come together to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, which is their New Year's, or for their calendar. And then 10 days later, you have Yom Kippur. And this is the holiest day of the Jewish year. This is a day of atonement where all Jews come together to fast and pray and to ask forgivenesses for their trespasses and things that they have done throughout the entire year that may not have been in following of those 613 mitzvahs. And then, like I said before, this is a universal day of prayer and fasting to ask forgiveness. And as with most Jewish holy days, this is from sundown of one day to sundown of the next day. Judaism, like many religions, has actually multiple religious texts, and not just one. The most important being the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is actually an acronym for 3 separate books in it. The first and the most important being the Torah. And the Torah is 5 separate books that give the 613 mitzvahs, or laws, that Jews have to follow. And it talks about their earliest creation and their patriarchs as a Hebrew people, as well as the Great Covenant, in which their God chose them to be his special people as long as they follow him and his laws. The second book found in the Tanakh is the Nevi'im. And these are histories of the Hebrew people, their records, their annals, and they show their God's intervention and role throughout their history. And lastly is the Ketuvim. And this is more esoteric, abstract principles, poetry that is found throughout and kind of intertwined throughout much of the Tanakh. What many people may not realize is that the Tanakh for Christians is actually the Old Testament. The two are basically synonymous. So if someone's ever come across the Bible or the Old Testament, that's actually the Jewish Tanakh. Other Jewish religious texts include the Talmud, and this is a very important text where it talks about the teachings and opinions of the Tanakh over hundreds of years by thousands of rabbis, and it gives their interpretation of those mitzvahs in more contemporary society for hundreds of years, including the different topics such as the following. So many different topics. There's also Midrash, which is exegesis or further explanation, critical interpretation of the Tanakh. Most importantly, the ones that you'll need to know are the Tanakh, the Torah, and the Talmud. So Judaism has different branches. Just like we saw with Taoism and Buddhism, Judaism has separate branches as well. The first one is the Orthodox branch. And this is where they have a strict interpretation and following of both the mitzvahs in the Torah, called written Torah, and oral Torah, which is those interpretations found in the Tanakh. And this is a very strict interpretation. So in the Torah it says that you shall not work on the Sabbath or Shabbat. And work was interpreted in the Tanakh as lighting a fire and other stuff like that. So for Orthodox Jews, this means on Shabbat, they cannot turn on a light switch, cannot turn on their car, or even turn on the TV, because to do so is to create electricity, which is to create a spark, which is to create fire, which means that you're working on Shabbat, and therefore not following the mitzvahs. Remember, your actions make you holy. And so, even though you're turning on the TV on Shabbat, that action means you're breaking that mitzvah, and so you're not holy. So, it's a very strict interpretation of the Torah. Whatever it says, that's the way it is. It does not change. It is static. Conservative Jews have a slightly different interpretation. Like Orthodox Jews, they follow both the written Torah and the oral Torah found in the Tanakh. But they do say that God's laws are able to be changed and adapted to modern times. So that more modern rabbis can say, you know what, even though the mitzvah says you shall not work on a Sunday, or on a Saturday, during Shabbat, well, in the modern times, turning on a light switch is not work. You probably burn 0.1 of a calorie in doing so. That's not work. So they have a more modern interpretation of Torah. And lastly, you have Reform Jews. And Reform Jews they see themselves more as a religion and less as a race of people. And they reject a lot of the ritual and ceremonial laws and some of the very strict interpretation of mitzvahs, and they refer to Judaism or see Judaism more as a religion for ethical and moral laws for how to live one's life and to have further connection with other Jews in the Jewish community and in keeping of their traditions. And you notice the pictures here that as sequential as we go down, that the way these Jewish people look in each picture is less and less different than many of the people around them. Remember, in Orthodox Judaism and in older Judaism, Jews created a separation between themselves, how they look and how they acted, and the world around them. And as we progress, there's less and less differences. As we had mentioned before, is considered to be a holy place throughout all of Judaism. And this is actually the traditional home of the Hebrew Jewish people, and is believed to be given to them by their God. And that's talked about that in the Torah. And Israel in this land has been conquered and reconquered and taken over many times by both the Jewish people and non-Jews alike. And ultimately, in 132 AD, the Jewish people were forcibly removed from their own homeland by the Roman Empire. And we'll be talking about that in the next slide. That removal of the Jewish people was called the diaspora. And originally, when the Romans conquered Israel in 63 BC, they had let the Jews live there as long as they were under Roman control. And the Jews did not necessarily like that because, for one reason, they were politically under the control of another culture or people. But secondarily, they were under the religious control of a group of people that was considered pagan or worshiped many gods and not their one true God in the Jewish belief. And they revolted. And so to retaliate against that Jewish revolt, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, considered to be the holiest site in all of Judaism. Again, the Jews revolt about 50 years later in a second revolt, and the Romans at this point in time had had enough. Now they forcibly removed all Jews from their homeland. They forcibly kicked them out and locked the door and didn't care where the Jewish people went as long as they were not there in Israel. So, and then they renamed this area as Palestine. It wasn't until 1948, only about 60, 70 years ago, did the Jewish people start to really come back to their own homeland, thousands of years later. And this diaspora, this removing of the Jewish people, is going to have lots of implications throughout all of history on the Jewish people, some that we'll be talking about this entire year. If you notice this picture here, it's showing in that blue dash line where the Jews went after they were forcibly removed by the Romans. Many of them went up into Europe. And if you notice that area around Poland, there's a huge area of a large Jewish settlement. This is going to have dramatic implications many years later, namely during the 1930s and 1940s under Nazi control. Additionally, if you notice those red dash lines, those were areas where Jewish people were kicked out again. After they've been resettled in 1290, they were kicked out of England. In 1492, they were removed from Spain. So not only were they kicked out of their own homeland, but wherever they settled, they were often being faced with persecution and different prejudice because of their religion and because of their race. And throughout history, the sad thing is, because of that, the Jewish people were often targeted and a scapegoat wherever they had settled. So in Judaism, as before, the ideal human being or exemplar is the person who follows all 613 mitzvahs. And if we boil down Judaism as a teacup, here we are, here's our rabbi, and he's thinking of a teacup. He would say that a teacup is holy because Jehovah, that's their name, one of the names of their God, chose it to be holy. And we, as his chosen people, will abide by the laws of using the teacup. Well, that's all we got, folks. Thank you for joining me, and we will see you at our next issue. Have a great day.